had a beautiful PowerPoint presentation that was going to make everything so clear to you this morning. And I forgot to download it on my computer and I don't have Wi-Fi, so alas, we're going to have no visuals this morning, but I think we can struggle.
Well, we appreciate that.
Yeah, I know. Maybe I'll email it out to you or something, just so I can say I did something with it. Well, thanks for being here. We are in our last week of this little series on Church of Christ Theology, or whatever we want to call it. And I was at the lake last week, so thanks, David, for filling in for me. You all talked about how we have been anti-creed in our past. I was thinking about it because I watched the class online, and you talk a lot about the Apostles' Creed, which is early and fairly simple, and I think that one's pretty easy for me to get behind. But this tradition of creeds has kind of broadened into all these statements of faith, right? If you look at most evangelical church websites, they'll have their statement of faith pretty prominent, and they're much more specific, generally, than the older creeds. Which is, I think, what bothered Alexander Campbell was the division created by these denominational distinctives. And so my kids go to a Christian school, and it's a broadly non-denominational ecumenical school, not Northland, it's Providence Classical School. But they've got a statement of faith, and they've asked me to consider whether I would ever think about serving on the board. And one of the things you have to do to serve on the board is sign the statement of faith. And they make all of their teachers sign the statement of faith. And I think I could. I don't think there's anything that I absolutely disagree with, although I'm probably interpreting some of the words and the meaning a little bit different than I think the original author probably intended in order, But I have found that I've been really uncomfortable with it. I think just because that's not my tradition to do that. But also because it feels stifling to me. It feels so limiting to sign on a line that these human words are exactly what I believe. And if I serve on the board for the next 5 or 6 years, I promise I will continue to believe all of them the way this person wrote it down, right? Because, of course, I believe what the Bible says, but why should we then try to use our own words to make that more clear, right? Do we think that this subset of human words we've written is actually more clear to what we have to believe than just the Bible itself? So, I don't know. That's been my kind of modern day struggle with this idea of creeds and statements of faith. I wanted to test a thought with y'all real quick that I'm not going to have time to get into, but it's just something that piqued my curiosity, and I don't know it enough to do a study on it or anything right now. A study, it's not a directly biblical concept, but it's one related to this idea of kind of how we identify our church group. Is the idea of a bounded set versus a centered set. Has anybody heard of that before? I get a couple nods maybe. So set theory is actually a mathematical theory, which I could really geek out on because I'm a mathematician by training. But it's basically how you define a group. And so you think like a Venn diagram. And so a bounded set is the kind of traditional, we have a tight boundary line. So if you think about where people are, we could have a spectrum of, what do you think on women's roles? Women cannot even speak in a church building to women can be elders, right? And so you get people kind of all along. And then you could have another one, what's something that's not so controversial, y'all throw things at me if I put it out there.
Instrumental music.
Instrumental music, maybe. Church of Christ only. Something like that. Worship styles, right? We split over whether you can have 2 services, whether you can have a group on stage, whether they can have microphones. So we'll say something about worship styles, right? Well, if you imagine this being every possible dimension of what you believe, everything that could be in a statement of faith, right? So it's really, there would be a lot more than 2 dimensions. But you've got people that believe, all sorts of different things across Christianity. And a bounded set says, well, we're going to write our statement of faith and clearly establish the boundaries right there. And so if you believe within these boundaries, you can be a member here. But if you're right there, you can't. And that's how most groups work. You have to have some idea of where a line is, right? But the thing that I thought was interesting about the centered set is this is sort of, the way we normally think of it is kind of doctrine, right? It's what you believe, and we're going to define the boundary. The centered set idea says we're going to really focus on what the center is, which for us, that's Jesus, right? And wherever you are in your current beliefs, whatever you believe about various topics, if you are genuinely striving to get closer to Jesus, like if you're focused at the center, if this is how you're moving, then you're welcome here, right? We're all focused on Jesus. Jesus is our center. We're going to focus all of our most important energy on understanding who Jesus is, the nature of Jesus. And if you want to join us on that journey of heading towards Jesus, like, you're probably okay here. Whereas if you happen to believe some similar things to me, for whatever reason, but you've decided you're going to actually kind of turn your back on Jesus, you don't fit in as well, right? Even if we happen to agree on some things, if you're actually like moving further away from Jesus because you don't want to focus on Jesus as the center, you're less a part of the group than if you disagree with me on more things, but you're working really hard to focus on Jesus. And so I thought it was an interesting idea. I don't know all the practical implications about what that would actually look like. But I thought it fit a little bit with our history because we haven't like written down statements of faith a lot. And so we've obviously divided over a lot of things. Like we've been very, very divisive. But that usually has more to do with like what the church can do. Can we have a kitchen? Can we, have more than one cup of communion? Versus what I believe. If I have a slightly different belief about something, like I'm not going to get necessarily kicked out of the Church of Christ for not signing on the dotted line. And, okay, maybe I'm missing certain. Maybe I'm trying to make it fit the mold better than it has historically. But I don't know. That's what I was sort of thinking about with statements of faith. Is like focus on what is the center and how do we better understand Jesus. And that's where we're all moving. And it's not necessarily that we have to identify the line in the sand of where your belief is acceptable or unacceptable. All right, I'm not going to do that today because I don't know enough about it to say any more than I just said. So what I want to look at today is some thoughts around power and politics, which I thought y'all might throw things at me when I talked about pacifism and nonviolence. But I survived that week, so I decided, why not tackle politics? And so, I've said I don't want to just define us as what we're not. But if you've always been in the Church of Christ, then I try to point out some things that I think are distinctive. You might not think that they sound unusual. And so I do want to look a little bit at what, other Christian groups do, just so we can kind of understand where differences lie within Christendom. And so if we think again about this sort of broader evangelical church in America, they tend to tie their history a lot to the Protestant Reformation of 500 years ago. And in particular, the early reformers like Martin Luther, John Calvin, were what's known as the magisterial Reformation. And magisterial, think of the term magistrate. So magisterial means basically having to do with authority or power. And in particular, it was this integration of church and state. So the Lutheran Church became an official church of Germany supported by taxes and everything, right? You could be identified as a German by being Lutheran, right? The Church of Scotland was a Presbyterian church, right? Calvin went to Geneva and tried to use political power to enforce the entire city of Geneva to adopt his reforms, right? So this sort of church and state being together is the magisterial reform. And so I saw one quote defining it where it said, the magistrate had a right to authority within the church, just as the church could rely on the authority of the magistrate to enforce discipline, suppress heresy, and maintain order. And so one idea is, if many evangelical churches, and to some extent tie themselves to this history of the magisterial Reformation, that kind of culture and perspective has continued to have some weight, some influence, right? This idea, I saw one Church of Christ commentator that said that they've never really left behind the old Constantine model, which if you know the idea of Constantine, he was the Roman emperor that said Christianity is not an illegal religion anymore. It actually wasn't him that made it the official religion of Rome. That was another emperor or two down the road. But this Constantinian model is the idea of Christendom being a combination of like political power and church. And to some extent, a lot of evangelical churches have had some trouble leaving that model behind, even though we live in a country where that's not officially the case. There's no state religion. And so I want to give one example that I think, I don't want to create a straw man that's more extreme than average, and I think some evangelicals would say this is a little bit on the fringes, but I think it's had a lot of influence in some aspects of the broader kind of Protestant culture. Has anybody heard of the Seven Mountain Mandate? All right, yeah, we are very Church of Christ. That's good, because I hate the Seven Mountain Mandate, but I want you to know what it is. So in 1975, there were 3 evangelical leaders who said that they heard a message from God ordering them to invade the 7 spheres of society: family, religion, education, media, entertainment, business, and government. And so the idea of the Seven Mountain Mandate is that there are these 7 mountains that control society and culture. And they're what I just read off. Society is influenced by government, media, entertainment, education. Get to you in a second. And that our mandate as Christians is to invade and conquer them. And if we can rule and control education, media, government, that we will then bring God's kingdom, I guess. I don't know exactly what language they use, but something like that. And that has been, while maybe somewhat small in the broader stream of American Christianity, a somewhat influential perspective in many spheres. Yeah, Trevor.
So this kind of sounds like totalitarianism when I learned about World War II in history class this year.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, it is very related. Many totalitarian leaders have used religion as one of the things that helps them consolidate power. So one of the books I've been using is this one over here by Richard Hughes, Reclaiming a Heritage. And he has a quote in it that I don't know if we would agree with or not, but I thought was at least interesting. He says, "To the extent that evangelicals seek to control the larger culture, they embrace a potential continuity between the church and the world, if only the world would submit to the sovereign rule of God. On the other hand, the restorationist vision points to a radical tear in the fabric of history. There is not the slightest possibility of continuity between the church and the world, and to the extent that Christians have made their peace with the world, the fabric of Christian history is badly torn." So he makes this argument that if we really think that we can sort of create a continuity between our broader world, not the church, but society, government, nations, world, true continuity between church and world, that we've misunderstood the degree to which the world is different than the church, or the church is different from the world. And so anyway, that was sort of his perspective on the differences. So I'm going to go through a few of our early leaders and mention some quotes from Campbell and Stone and things like that, but I'll pause for a second. Any questions, reactions? Does that resonate with anything you hear from broader Christian Protestant America, or surprise you? Or... All right. Well, let's. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I think it's interesting that he says this, because even today when we vote, we're thinking that this is going to bring morals to our world, and it sounds good, and we can still vote that way, but they're just too different. It's like laws don't bring morals.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and I want us to wrestle with kind of where that balance or that line lies, because I'm going to read some of these quotes from our early leaders, and many of them were probably more radical in this than we would be. I think it was Lipscomb that said that Christians shouldn't serve on juries, they shouldn't vote, they shouldn't, very broad, extremely apolitical. And I don't think many of us would land there, but I think it's at least interesting to consider where he was coming from and what do we agree with, what do we disagree with, how would we nuance it, that kind of thing. So Barton Stone essentially preached a total rejection of politics and non-involvement in civil government. Barton Stone has a quote that says, "While we take sides in the political contests of this evil day, we virtually renounce the laws of our king." And so I thought that was an interesting one. We're going to see this kind of recurring theme of the idea of the kingdom of God and the kingdoms of men. And are we trying to serve two masters or not? and again, I think we might nuance it in terms of how we think we should be involved. But Barton Stone, one of our earliest leaders in the American Restoration movement at least, took this pretty hard stance that that if we're getting too enmeshed in politics, we're effectively renouncing our allegiance to the laws of our King, Jesus. Alexander Campbell, so another name for the American Restoration movement is the Stone-Campbell movement. So these were kind of our two first leaders here in America, Stone and Campbell. Campbell was a first-generation immigrant to America. And so he grew up knowing firsthand the power of the European religious establishments. He actually was a member of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. And so he had seen, Alexander Campbell, when he grew up in, I think mostly Ireland, but then he spent a little time in Scotland, kind of this state church. And he believed that in America, denominations were still chiefly interested in maintaining power and privilege. So Alexander Campbell was very concerned about this idea that Presbyterians and Anglicans and whatever are going to come over here and try to maintain the same degree of political power that he had seen them have in Europe, and he did not want that. Alexander Campbell didn't want a state church or an establishment of that type. And so his scathing denunciation of sects, clerics, creeds, and ecclesiastical structure all had a great deal to do with his fear of a Protestant establishment in America. So one of the reasons he didn't like creeds and denominations and ecclesiastical structure like bishops or conferences, synods of church hierarchy, is he was worried they were a way of setting up a political power that a denomination could essentially try to maintain its influence and privilege. And one thing that I think is really actually fascinating, because we can look back on that and say, that was a little crazy to be that concerned about it. I have sort of always thought America has always had a separation of church and state. And the state of Massachusetts actually did not abolish having an official state church until 1833. So all the way up until 1833, the state of Massachusetts had an official endorsed state church. I think it was the Congregational Church. And so that was a part of our history, and at least a couple of places was having an established church. And it kind of took a little while to unwind that. Okay, and then David Lipscomb. So we all know Lipscomb University, right? David Lipscomb was sort of one of our second generation leaders. I want to read a brief story. I think it's less than a page. This is going to sound like it has more to do with pacifism, which I talked about a couple weeks ago, but I think it reflects his view of involvement in the government in general. So I thought this was an interesting story. And this is a book by John Mark Hicks and Bobby Valentine, Kingdom Come. So it says, other than the fact that a war had been raging for some time, it seemed like just another Lord's Day in Columbia, Tennessee. Yet on this Sunday, an unusual guest appeared in the congregation, wearing the insignia of the Confederate States of America. The officer was on a special mission from General Nathan Bedford Forrest to determine if David Lipscomb was guilty of treason against the Confederacy. It was not the first time that Lipscomb had raised eyebrows. On one occasion, as he was preaching, a man called for 12 men to help him string up the preacher. Lipscomb had declared that it was wrong for Christians to kill.
Amen.
Even Yankees. Let's see, I'm going to skip this a little bit. I'll give you the full pacifist story. So, a committee representing Churches of Christ in Middle Tennessee had already petitioned the Confederate government for an exemption from conscription laws because Christians cannot participate in bloody conflicts, which civil governments so frequently engage. When Central Tennessee fell under the federal military authority, a meeting was organized with Union officials. In this meeting, David Lipscomb, among others, presented a similar request to the U.S. Army. The petitioner stated that we recognize it as a solemn duty we owe to God, to the government, save when the government requires of us something contrary to the letter and spirit of the Christian religion. So he's saying we do have a solemn obligation to the government, except if the government asks us to do something that goes against our faith. So when General Force officers arrived on Sunday morning, Lipscomb was already suspect. But undeterred by the military presence, Lipscomb preached his lesson as faithfully as he knew how. When the officer reported on whether or not the sermon was treasonous, he said, "I have not reached a conclusion as to whether or not the doctrine of the sermon is loyal to the Southern Confederacy, but I am profoundly convinced that he is loyal to the Christian religion." So I thought it was interesting because, David Lipscomb found himself on both sides, right? Under Confederate control at one point, under Union control at one point. And yet he basically said, like, I can't go against my faith. And so I thought it was a really interesting story that they literally, a general sent somebody in to watch him and report back whether he was loyal or treasonous. And he basically said, I don't know for sure if he's loyal or treasonous, but I know that he's faithful through his religion. I think that's all I had on Lipscomb. I can see my PowerPoint on my phone, I just can't show it to you. One thing that I did forget to say, just kind of about broader evangelicalism that I thought was kind of interesting, is you might wonder, like, am I making up a distinction, or are there some real differences here? One thing is, I don't think, and I could be wrong, I don't think I have ever seen a flag in a Church of Christ sanctuary or auditorium or worship center or whatever we want to call them. That's not that uncommon in other Protestant churches. It's not universal. There are a lot that don't have them, but it's not that uncommon to have an American flag in the sanctuary of other Protestant churches. And so there's this story that's written up for Pepperdine. You can find it on the Pepperdine website, of somebody that grew up Church of Christ. She ended up at a Disciples of Christ church and had tremendous disagreements about a wide range of things, but never had big problems. We always loved each other. The one thing that almost tore the relationship apart was over flags and whether they should be removed from the sanctuary or not. And her conclusion, after they did a study in this Disciples of Christ church, was render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's. Luke 20:22. Standing the flag in the sanctuary where the worship of God is the goal diminishes the distinction between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of this world. And we cannot serve two masters.
I find it interesting that all the way back to the first century when Jesus was here, this was an issue.
Yeah.
For the Christians to understand, even all the way back then.
Yeah, there are these little books that are called A Week in the Life series, written by biblical scholars. So you can find like A Week in the Life of Ephesus, A Week in the Life of Corinth, A Week in the Life of a Roman centurion. And they all deal with a certain Bible story or biblical context, but they're written as fiction. And I remember one where one of the main characters was like a silversmith or something. And at what was essentially the union meeting, they wouldn't have called it a union, but like guild, kind of like a guild meeting, he refused to offer a sacrifice to Caesar. And he was worried that he was going to get kicked out of not just the guild, but effectively the city, and that his family would starve to death. And so, yeah, we think of persecution as always being top down, like Nero said, go persecute the Christians. But a lot of times it was just this culture of, if you're not going to do what helps us be prosperous, right? If you're not going to offer sacrifices to Caesar, if you're not going to offer sacrifices to Zeus, whatever, you're not welcome here anymore. And that was a big tension. And this idea that Jesus is Lord, that was the language they used for Caesar. So it was a political statement in a sense from the beginning. Okay, so that was Lipscomb. Last one I've got is James Harding. So we just covered one university, we'll go to the other university. James Harding. One of his quotes is, "Christians are citizens of the kingdom of heaven, and their king is the Lord Jesus Christ. And as their king tersely puts it, no man can serve two masters." So for Harding, government was not a necessary prop to support the Christian faith, but was actually a seduction away from an utter dependence on God. And so I thought that was interesting. Sometimes we view political power as sort of a necessity to support the church, in a sense. And he said, actually, we ought to think more about whether we're being seduced away from our true support, which is from God, which has been something that I've tried to wrestle with a little bit, because in terms of how political should we be, one of the things that's a question is, how do we think of the church versus individuals, right? Like, individuals vote and participate in politics in a wide variety of things, but as a church congregation, we typically don't preach to that from the stage on Sunday mornings or whatever, right? And I think there is an important distinction there between what do we do as a gathered people of God. But one other interesting thing for me is just power is awfully seductive. And I think I have to do a lot on myself to not fall too much under its influence. And politics is one of those things, right? We can think, well, if I just get the right person in this office, if I just get the right party here, if I just influence, and then, and sometimes that's true, but if I get too caught up in the power of it, I think that can be a dangerous thing.
But don't you think that, I guess I look at it as a focus thing, which is, my personal belief of it is, if you're focused on God's will and what's going on in the world from a God perspective, I kind of think of them as two separate things, which is, that's a power thing from a worldly perspective, whereas I think I try to focus on what is God's focus and what's God's intent, without having to get the power in the world kind of thing. I think,
Yeah, and I think it can be a little bit of that render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God what is God's thing. And then the debate comes, where's that line? What exactly is Caesar's and what exactly is God's, right? Yeah.
So I was recently struck by some of these same ideas watching the coronation of King Charles. Because on one hand, when I first started watching it, I'm deeply troubled, right? Because it is a complete wedding between church and state, right? I mean, it is a church service that ordains this man with political power. But as I watched more and more of it, the church language, the things that were being said, the scriptures that are being read, the prayers that are being said, the sermon that's preached, like all of that sounds faithful to me, right? Like there is a sense in which what is happening in this moment is the church is saying, this is what it means for us to be faithful to God, and you are actually subservient to God. So don't, and so it's so tricky to tease out, is that a way of baptizing political power and covering it so it makes it look like we're being faithful? Or is it actually holding that power accountable? And I think that's part of what makes this conversation so tricky is which is influencing the other more.
Yeah, Caesar tends to step in and say, this is our problem, so you just shut up and stay out of the way.
Yeah.
And they take away, say, moral issues or whatever that the church is able to deal with, and declare it political and say, you can't, so we get into that.
Yeah.
And it makes it hard then, what do you do?
Yeah.
Especially for, when you preacher having to address some type of situation.
Yeah, that's good.
That's what Lipscomb faced,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think about the symbols too, because the symbols are powerful. And I'm going to forget which European king this was. I don't remember my medieval history that well, but the Pope used to crown kings, and it was a symbol that the Pope is more powerful than the king. And there was one king that the story is that he grabbed the crown from the Pope's hands and put it on his own head. And it was a symbol that I'm not going to let you crown me. I'm going to crown myself. And if we go back to that idea of flags in the church sanctuary, a number of the churches that will put an American flag in their sanctuary, there is apparently also a Christian flag, which I didn't realize was a thing. But there's a Christian flag, and so they'll sometimes have both. Well, my understanding is technically, according to our U.S. flag law, no other flag is supposed to be flown at the same height as the American flag. And so if you have
So
both...
Texas, baby.
Technically, the U.S. flag should be placed in a higher position than the Christian flag, which if you think about that symbolism, I mean, that's why that law exists, is because symbols have power, right?
And the symbolism there, though, if you put an American flag, you're just saying, it's like missionaries who've gone, in the past, who've gone and set up mission camps and brought people to the church building, the fancy church building they built.
Yeah.
Because they were bringing their own ideas of what this is and working with the culture. So the American flag, you're saying to some visitor who comes from Africa or Asia or whatever, this is most important. Goes back to the symbol idea.
Yeah.
And that's not what it's, and the Christian flag would be the same thing, because that's kind of depending on what group you're with too.
Yeah. Well, so I've got 5 or so verses I was going to read through, and I would love to get to them because I want this to be a scriptural class, but we're already getting into the discussion that I think is really fascinating, and I know we're going to run low on time. So I'd like to think just for a little while about what do we think about this today, and what does it even really mean? Because I've been talking sort of in terms of politics, but politics is a really broad word. And to what extent should Christians be political or not political? And so I was trying to think, well, what other words might be helpful? To me, one concept is nationalism. So I think that the church should not be nationalistic. And it gets to what was just being said about visitors from other countries and things like that. Like we're a universal church. We support missionaries in other countries. There are churches all over the world. When we gather on Sunday mornings and take communion, we know there are churches all over the world taking communion. I mean, albeit in different time zones, so it's not like we're synchronized to the moment. But we realize we're a part of a universal church. And so while we, as individuals who are American, can, I think, be proud to be Americans, I love my country, and I'm going to be involved in the political system to some degree. As a church, we're not an American church, per se, right? We're a congregation that happens to exist in America, but we're a part of the universal church. And I think that, when we gather as a church and we profess our allegiance to Christ the King, and we're taking communion, we know that our brothers and sisters in Ukraine and in Brazil, and, are all taking communion too. I think that idea that the church itself supersedes, outlasts, transcends any national boundary is an important one to me. The other one that I thought of that might be helpful is the idea of partisan. So sometimes you'll hear the slogan, political but not partisan. I don't know if that's perfect, but I think there's something there. So it depends on how you define political. Yeah, one definition I found was essentially, where did I put it? The activities associated with the governance of a country, especially among conflict of individuals or parties hoping to have power. So to that extent, if politics is the governance of a nation and trying to get power, I can see why the church, I think, shouldn't be directly engaged in politics. But we can also think of politics as what we believe about how society should be structured. What do we believe about money and justice and, neighborhoods and things like that? And do we think Jesus had anything to say about money and justice and community? Of course. And so in some sense, our religion is directly political in that it has something to say about the nature of a good community, a healthy society, how we should view money and neighbors and, all that. And yet I don't think that our church ought to be partisan. I remember teaching the community room in 2016, which we had, that was probably our biggest class. We had a lot of people in the community room. And I knew every morning when I taught, there was going to be somebody that was hardcore pro-Trump. There was going to be somebody that had been at a Bernie Sanders rally the weekend before, right? We had a wide array of opinions in that room, and we all loved each other. And I think that some churches have gotten pretty inherently partisan, and I don't know how that can't be divisive in a way that we shouldn't be. And so again, there is a sense in which our message is political, but I don't think that it is or should be partisan. And then we talked a little bit about the idea of church versus individual too, right? Maybe we as individuals are political in a way that the church as a congregation isn't. But what do y'all think? I mean, yes, no, where would you nuance? Where would you disagree? How is this striking you about what this means for us today?
It's that power thing that's so tempting. So I understand what you said, how you have to control yourself. When I had an opportunity, I saw I could become a very nasty person. And so when people ask me, don't you want to be a manager or department manager? No, I don't want the power. I don't want that because I know what I can become. And that's the same. I think even in the church, we have people who want the power and don't recognize those differences.
I think one of the hardest things as we wrestle with this is that we live in just a fundamentally different society than the first century church, right? I mean, they could not have been involved in Roman politics the way that we can in a democracy. But if you think about the way the church had an impact on its world in the first couple centuries, they took in babies that had been left to die in the wilderness, right? They took in women that were single and couldn't support themselves. They took in slaves and treated them as brothers. They had no power, and they didn't attempt to influence Caesar through power, but by resisting the gladiatorial games and valuing children and slaves, the church had a tremendous influence. And I think one thing that you can see in our history, and this goes back to Lipscomb and Harding and Stone, is a greater focus on kingdom ethics than on worldly power. And again, I'm not saying there's no time to use power well. I think power can be used well. But I think if our primary focus is on discipleship, transformation of the heart, kingdom ethics, that's often a better way to influence the world than a grasping at power. What else? Other thoughts on the topic?
Yeah, I think access to power is intoxicating for a lot of people, a lot of us. I mean, you can go all the way back to James and John's mother asking who can sit on the right and the left. And there's a whole lot of people in this world just are intoxicated by perhaps being close to someone that may be in power.
Yeah, one of the verses that I wrote down, I think happens right after James and John's mother asked them who can be on the right and the left. So it's Matthew 20, starting in verse 25. Jesus called them together and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant." And so, yeah, that story, that's what they wanted, right? Was power. They thought left and right meant seats of authority next to the king, and what left and right really meant was the two crosses on either side of them.
Yeah, but I just see a lot of people that don't necessarily, would not say that they want power themselves, but they are absolutely intoxicated by being close to someone that either has power or has a lot of money.
Yeah.
And either one of those things are very, very, it's kind of like a moth to flame for certain personality types.
Yeah, please.
I'll start with this as a incomplete thought.
Aren't they all?
But it's interesting, it's just, I don't know, it's so layered because, I think about politics and you think about power and it's so outcome based and you're mandating certain things. You're not, as Christians, we're like to talk about ethics and heart versus this is now the law. But then the question, I don't know, always, so I talk to her, I talk to friends about it, it's like, but do some of the laws make people's hearts hardened for, like, does it help or hurt as a Christian, right? Like, I don't need these laws necessarily to evangelize or to talk to you about Christ, but at the same time, if society is saying that all these things are permissive, how much harder or difficult, so then it's that fine line of you don't need the power, but at the same time, does it help or aid you as a Christian? We do want to, lead people to Christ, and certain societies might, have a structure or foundation that makes it more ripe or opportune.
Yeah.
But not getting so caught up in that outcome. Like I say, incomplete thought. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't
No,
know.
no,
It's so layered of like you can't say that you don't care at all about it because.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a great thought because I do care what our laws are. And I think there's always, I think, an interesting tension between Christian ethics and law, right? Like we would all agree murder and theft should be illegal. Adultery is not illegal, right? And most of us probably wouldn't push to make it illegal. We don't necessarily want the government trying to throw people in jail over it. But where do we draw the line? Because there are a lot of things we as Christians think are immoral, but that doesn't mean none of them should be laws, right? It is important what laws say are permissible or not permissible and how it influences society.
Yeah, because even on the 7 mountains, right, with the media, the same with adultery, right? It's not a law, but I don't care about conquering the media, but at the same time, it's so you can turn on your TV now and it's like an average sitcom, the plot is adultery or something like. So I should want to have some influence of how, but yeah.
Yeah, I think the thing that bothered me the most about the 7 Mountains thing was some of the language that they used, like invade and conquer, right? And so if we think of it more in terms of like influence, maybe there's, I don't know if that's too small a nuance, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I think we should be expanding God's shalom into the world, right? We should be doing good things to create a good influence. I just don't want to get caught up in the idea that Christians have to like conquer this mountain, right? Through power, but yeah, I don't know.
Either Lipson's example, where North and South couldn't figure him out, or didn't see him as a threat, or however, or the early Christians, that was always by example, it was always by doing. It wasn't about going and say, Caesar, give us a new law, or going and say, you know, you need to do, you know, they went out and just helped. In relation to that story, and the Roman emperor said, well, why can't the pagans do that? You know, become like the Christians, and first plague came along, everybody let down, except the Christians. So I think by doing is maybe we spend too much time worrying about politics and too little time out doing.
Yeah, I think it was one of these books had a question at a chapter end that said, which do you get more emotional about? Politics or what's happening with the kingdom of God? And if you think about, where do we spend time? Where do we have big emotions? Where do, you know, it can be a way of checking priorities. Did I see?
I think, to me, it's kind of a question of, you know, what is the purpose of, so, got a couple of very cerebral lawyers here. We spend a lot of time just talking about random things like this, and the idea of the law is to create an orderly society. You know, biblically, we have a lot of principles and guidance, but when it comes to direction on specific scenarios, we don't always find those. And so this is all, you know, if you think about the idea of the law or the structure of the government working to create an orderly society, to me it really comes down to, this is a question we talk about a lot, which is, particularly during big voting years, do we think that the law and the people we vote for are a reflection of society, or are they meant to influence society? And I think where you stand on that determines how scary being involved in politics is, right? If your hope is that that the law will reflect the majority of people's beliefs, then it's less scary, because then you're doing your groundwork, and then your hope is just that the law will help kind of govern and keep that order that most of us agree is respectable. But I think so much of it now has become where so many people are in power who are trying to influence what society is doing and how it moves, that's where it gets kind of scary. So really it's that question of, have we created a situation where our law is reflecting what most of us believe, and then we kind of work behind the scenes to get there? Or is it more of like a, you know, no, we want society to move this way, certain people, you know?
It's good.
So I used to not vote at all, because I was influenced by guys like Lipscomb.
So, can I, real quick,
Yeah.
I always had, except there was one election cycle where I was listening to an Anabaptist guy on a podcast talk about why he didn't vote, and it was a lot about this power stuff, right, this being drawn into power. I decided not to vote. I thought it was interesting. After that election cycle, I heard him again later say he thought that it was such an important election cycle that he voted for the first time. You convinced me not to vote this one when I had before, and then you voted it. So, sorry. So, okay.
Well, so this is, you know, it's kind of through grad school, I'm listening to guys like Lipscomb, and I think one of the direct quotes from Lipscomb is, voting is worse than dancing, right? So I'm convicted, right? I don't want to do that. But there's actually a movie that changed my mind on it. I've probably seen The Free State of Jones, Matthew McConaughey. It's about this like anti-Confederacy little group of people in Mississippi that are like fighting it back against the Confederacy within the Confederacy. But kind of tells that story, but then at the very end, there's like this epilogue almost about former slaves trying to have voting rights and the struggle for that. And there was this realization that like there is I'm not choosing whether I have power or not. I do have power.
Right.
And so how do I responsibly wield that?
Thanks for bringing that up when I gotta let people go.
Yeah.
Because, you know, I mean, that was a topic that I was sort of waiting to see if it would come up or not. But I would love, and you know, I can stay another 5 minutes or so, but I know I'm gonna have to let y'all go pretty soon. more non-white perspectives or even non-Church of Christ perspectives, because I think, Church of Christ has our own particular history. But one thing that I do worry about when we talk about not being political is my understanding, speaking from, very limited understanding, is that historically black churches have been more of a gathering point, rallying point for important political issues. And if you read ACU and Pepperdine lecture topics from the 60s, you wouldn't know that there was a civil rights movement going on. We just didn't talk about it. And so it is relatively easier for me to say, I'm not going to be involved because I'll probably be okay no matter what happens. And more marginalized groups, that has been, the reason I worry about that a little bit is, we're a more diverse church than average, I think. But as you think about that potential increasing of diversity of churches integrating over time, do we lose, what do we lose in the uniqueness, of churches with historical perspectives that were more, unique like that? And if, so, I don't know, I'm rambling now, but it's an interesting topic to me.
Yeah,
an important
well,
one.
and, I was thinking, okay, we have these quotes from these theologians and people in the history of Churches of Christ and the Reformation, but they're all white men. And I'm so curious, I wish I knew if you had asked women or black Christians at the time, would there have been different perspectives as to how political we should be? I have no idea, I wish I knew. It'd be really interesting.
Yeah. Anybody want to venture any other thoughts in the last few minutes we've got before I need to let y'all go for sure?
I did, but it's much too.
Yeah, I know. And I didn't even read through a lot of the stuff I prepared for today, and it still wasn't enough time. Well, thanks for being here. I appreciate it. It's been an interesting journey for a few weeks. Have a good summer. And I'll let y'all go so we can get over to the auditorium.